Welcome back to The Explainer. Today, we are tackling an absolute mammoth of a topic. We're doing a deep dive into the massive new blockbuster adaptation of Homer's ancient epic, The Odyssey, directed by the one and only Christopher Nolan. Now, whether you are a diehard fan of classical Greek literature or you just love a gigantic Hollywood spectacle, we're going to unpack exactly how a 3,000-year-old poem got translated into our modern cinematic language. And, maybe more importantly, what got lost in that translation. Okay, let's start right here with this staggering opening weekend box office number. $264 million. Yeah, let that sink in for a second. That massive figure is undeniable proof that we are living in a full-blown Odyssey frenzy right now. We aren't just talking about a modest historical drama. This is a cultural event. But honestly, it begs a really fascinating question. How on earth did a 3,000-year-old poem manage to completely conquer the modern box office? Well, the truth is, adaptations usually reveal way more about our own current cultural anxieties and tastes than they do about the original source text. For a director to make a myth resonate today, they have to filter it through a distinctly modern lens. Section 1, The Modern Odyssey Frenzy, Reimagining a Classic. The sheer scale of this film's success is just breathtaking. IMAX screens are completely sold out months in advance, and in a really fun twist, physical book translations of Homer's original poem are actually surging right up the bestseller charts at the same time. A huge driver of all this hype is just the pure gravity and ambition of Nolan's casting. I mean, we've got Matt Damon stepping in as a very grim Odysseus. Lupita Nyong'o plays a scarred Helen. You've got Samantha Morton as a magnificent Circe, Charlize Theron as Calypso, Zendaya as Athena, and Anne Hathaway as Penelope. It is a powerhouse lineup, and that heavy-hitting cinematic weight that Nolan brought to the myth is totally palpable. Section 2, A Twisted, Coiling Structure, Homer Meets Nolan. This perfectly illustrates why a director famous for incredibly complex, mind-bending movies like Inception and Memento was absolutely the perfect choice to tackle this text. Because honestly, Homer's original poem was basically the ancient equivalent of Inception. It's not just a simple point A to point B story. It uses parallel timelines and a wildly nonlinear narrative. First, you have the 10-year backstory of the Trojan War. Then, Odysseus is trapped for 7 years with Calypso. Meanwhile, we're simultaneously following a 3-day search by his son Telemachus. From there, the whole thing spirals into one crazy night of flashbacks with monsters and witches, and it all finally converges on a 2-day, straight-up Tarantino-esque bloodbath of revenge back in Ithaca. Nolan masterfully captures that twisted, coiling architecture. But while we can praise the structure all day, we have to ask a tougher question. What happens to the epic's delicious darkness? Because when you take an ancient Greek worldview and squeeze it through a 21st century Hollywood studio system, something fundamental is going to shift. Section 3, A Very Different Odysseus, The Hero's Guilt. If we look at the striking differences between the original literary character and Matt Damon's on-screen portrayal, it reveals a ton about our modern sensibilities. So, in Homer's corner, you have an Odysseus who is incredibly loquacious, he's charming, and he's a masterful rhetorical liar who is fiercely proud of his warrior lineage. He is the ultimate adaptable survivor. But flip over to Nolan's version, and you get a hero who is grim, laconic, agonizingly guilt-stricken, and just heavily burdened by the destruction of Troy. And the idea that Odysseus bears a moral burden for the destruction of Troy, that is pure 100% Nolan. Homer's poem is definitely a post-war story, but it is absolutely not an anti-war story. To the ancient Greeks, war was destructive, sure, but it was just an accepted fact of life. Damon's agonizing guilt really reflects a distinctly modern, Judeo-Christian sensibility that Nolan has mapped right onto the character. Section 4, Erasing the Gods, Humanizing the Myth. Now let's talk about Nolan's decision to basically erase the Olympian gods from the board, in an effort to completely humanize the narrative. The practical, cinematic reasoning here is pretty clear and perfectly summed up by this quote. It's easier to imagine gods in a poem than to have them quivering awkwardly on a cloud in a film. Cinema is a deeply human medium. Trying to literally show immortal gods on a screen can very quickly feel clumsy or even unintentionally funny. But man, think about what we lose by making that choice. By stripping the Olympian gods of any meaningful role, the epic loses a lot of its lightness and its wit. For instance, Charlize Theron's Calypso completely loses her brilliant moment where she rails against the sexual double standards of the gods. And that famous, beautifully flirtatious spark between Zendaya's Athena and Damon's Odysseus? Totally missing. The dynamic interactions just get flattened out so the film can focus strictly on human trauma. Section 5. Taming the Epic. Sanitizing for Modern Eyes. This brings us to what I think is the most fascinating part of this explainer: how modern Hollywood actively sanitizes ancient moralities for our modern eyes. Nolan didn't just project his own anxieties onto the story, he actively subtracted Homer's. Let's walk through a few major cuts. First, the horrific hanging of the enslaved women, which Homer brutally described as their feet twitching like doves caught in a trap. That's gone. That removes the deeply disturbing darkness of ancient justice. Second, the scene where young Nausicaa finds a battered, naked Odysseus on the beach, erased, and with it goes a very playful sexual spark. Finally, Penelope's strange ambivalence and obliqueness towards her suitors is totally ironed out, which unfortunately strips away some really complex layers of her character. But let's be real for a second. Would modern cinemagoers actually queue up, buy popcorn, and sit down to watch a row of enslaved women being hanged? Probably not. We can absolutely validate the studio accountant's fears here. Leaving that kind of deeply uncomfortable, brutal ancient morality in a $250 million summer blockbuster would for sure risk alienating a huge chunk of the modern audience. Which brings us to this essential takeaway: whoever reads the Odyssey inescapably does so through the prism of their own prejudices. And listen, Nolan isn't wrong for changing the text. There isn't some pure, definitive, original oral text to return to anyway. Every single adapter, throughout all of history, stamps their own time, their own place, and their own moral framework right onto this material. It perfectly sums up our conclusion today. What you will learn in the film is about ourselves. Reading the poem turns the gaze outward to a reality that is foreign, wild, and strange. The movie reflects exactly what our modern society can stomach. But the book? The book forces us to face a wild, uncomfortable, ancient reality head-on. So, I'm going to leave you with this final provocative thought to chew on. Are our modern adaptations actually preserving the past, or are they really just a mirror, reflecting our own reflection right back at us? I highly encourage you to go open the book itself and discover a shimmering, layered world that, honestly, no IMAX camera could ever truly capture. Thanks for joining me for this explainer, and keep learning.